Good morning. Says number 2, last week was number 1, the Christian worldview. This is about how we see the world, how we interact with it, how we conceive of all things working together. And what I said last week and what I will continue to impress is that the Christian worldview is predominantly one in which Christ is at the very center, and on account of that, for that reason, the things of the head, the things of the intellect, the things of the mind cohere with the things of the heart, with the things of the soul, with the deeper man. The thing that I pointed out in last week's lesson was primarily when you look out in this age that you and I are privy to, we see this, we interact with people of this sort, we see it all over the news, we see it in conversations, we see it in religious conceptions, we see it in certain scientific paradigms that people hold, that there is a discord that exists between the head and the heart of man. And predominantly what that is there are certain scientific biases that we've presupposed. We've said, this is the fact of it. But upon that conclusion, there then becomes a discord between what we know of man and what we know of the inner man, what we know of man and him being a personal creature, him being a creature that is very concerned with love, him being a moral creature, him having questions that extend beyond mere biology. And maybe the best example of what it means to have a head and a heart that are in discord is to look at Richard Dawkins and what he recently said in an interview. He's looking out and he sees a divided world. He sees a warring world. He sees all of the turmoil of the world in which we live. And Dawkins, who is an espoused atheist, and in fact, for decades, he's been an atheist of sort of the militant sort, almost an evangelistic atheist, trying to prove to the world that atheism is the truer thing. But the thing that strikes me, and this was not his conception in the former years, I don't know how recent this development is, but he said that he is a cultural Christian. And he went on to define that as saying, he said, I don't believe in the Bible. I don't believe that a word of it is true. This is what he said. And why? Because what is his paradigm in which he lives? It is a paradigm in which God doesn't exist, in which everything can be explained naturally. But then he said, but I think that the world gets on better when people act like Christians. And when he was comparing Christianity to Islam and perhaps some of these other religions, he said that Christianity is the one to be favored for how Christianity deals with people, for how Christianity sees people. And you wonder, why is it that he can have such a romantic conception, saying on one hand that all you are, if you're rendered down to the bottom level, all you are is a summary of atoms and material that has a natural explanation. Our cosmology is completely without God. You are essentially ancient stardust that has been formulated into what you see today. That's what he says is the fact of it. All that we are is chemical processes and substance and material, and yet life is better when we act like and live like Christians, with a certain kind of faith, a certain thing we're working toward, and a certain standard and a certain ethic by which we live. That's interesting to me. That is the discord that I'm talking about. And today I think I'll get a little bit into why that discord exists and then how it is that we bring it back together. This is really what the entire series is about, is relieving that tension that exists between what you espouse and what you presuppose intellectually and what it is that in the soul, in the conscience, and in the deeper understanding of man you know to be true. So it's about bringing head and hearts together. Now, this is a picture here of Francis Schaeffer, who I owe a great deal of debt to him He died well before I was born. He died in the 80s. I was born in 89. He died a few years before I was even born. But I'm reading through all of his works, and I have been for years, and his conception of how the Christian faith fits into this world and how it explains the deeper questions and how it all coheres. It's rational. It is reasonable. He has helped me significantly. So I want to describe for you this idea that he uses quite a bit through all of his works. This is Schaeffer's conception of it. The truth of it is not Schaeffer's. The truth of it is built into the world because of the God who created it. And yet he conceived of it this way, and I think it's a very helpful way. I want you to imagine a house in which there are two levels. There's an upper story to the house, and there's a lower story to the house. And the upper story concerns things like love, virtue, faith, religion, the things of God, the inner man, the spirit, what we might say are the transcendent things, the deeper philosophical answers that we would grab hold of. That's the upper story. And the lower story, the first story of this house, is the natural things. These are things like biology. These are things like atoms and mathematics and physics and all of the things that we can observe with the senses, the things we can see, taste, feel, smell, all of that. So there's the upper story, which is really the things of the spirit. There's the lower story, which is the things of the physical order. And that's how he described it. And then all the way back to Thomas Aquinas, the way that Aquinas defined this is as grace and nature. I'm not sure if in your Christian readings you've ever seen the grace-nature distinction, but Thomas Aquinas was one that coined it in this way. He said the upper story essentially is the things of grace. The lower story is the things of nature. So Francis Schaeffer says higher stuff would be God the Creator, heaven and heavenly things, the way that the unseen realm interacts with the physical world, and so on. That's grace. Nature is the earth, the earthly things, what is visible, what man is able to do by his own devices. So that's how he conceived of this. And the important thing for us is that from the time of Aquinas, and Aquinas lived much later than a lot of the philosophers, but from his time on, and even before him, even if it wasn't coined in this way, all of the philosophers believed that there was a way for these things to cohere. These were not in contradiction to one another. There was no disparity between them. They were not like two disconnected ideas that you have to irrationally jump from one to get to the other. The philosophers believed that these could be connected. You could go from one to the other. You could go back and forth. They were somewhat involved even in one another, and they had good reasons for this. So they believed that these things could be connected. Now, to use the terms I was using last week, what they believed is that the head and the heart of man, the head, which is oftentimes concerned with the lower order, those kinds of things, and yet the soul of man, the spirit of man that brings about these deeper questions, they said and they recognized there's a way for these to be in coherence. What they would say is that the things of nature, the things you perceive, the things you see with your eyes, hear with your ears, feel with your hands, the things you can measure in a test tube, all of the results of science, they actually led to these higher things. They pointed you to them. They spoke of them. So there was, imagine between this first and second story of this house, imagine a staircase where you can access the second story. You don't have to just jump to it. There's actually an access point to it. These are connected. So this was the conception from the time of Aquinas and on, and even before him. This is how Aristotle said it. Aristotle said that science is concerned with our knowledge of a thing through its proximate cause, whereas wisdom is concerned with our knowledge of a thing through its primary cause. And what he meant is, if you're sitting underneath a tree and an apple falls on your head, the proximate cause is gravity. And yet, once you've established that there's such a thing as gravity, the heart of man, the mind of man, is seeking always for a higher question. There's something higher. Why is it that there's gravity in the first place? Why even is there an apple? Why does it look good? Why does it taste good? Why is it designed so well? Why does a little seed grow up into a tree? These are the deeper questions. The idea is that physics ought to move you to metaphysics, and they always have. This is the way that it works. This is the way God has created our brains. Herman Bavinck, again, another man to whom I owe a great deal of debt in helping me understand the way that the world works. Herman Bavinck, I quoted him last week. I'll quote him again right now. He wrote this in his little book, Christian Worldview. He said, just as sense perception is the basis of all science, the results of science are and remain the starting point of philosophy. And you'll recognize that in this day, science and scientists often make a categorical error. They often attempt to answer questions that are outside of their own realm, that are outside of their own field. You cannot put love in a test tube. If you try to render it down to mere chemical processes, man is left despaired. It does not answer the things that man is really questioning. The thing that Bavinck was really saying is that when you look out at the world, when you see what's there, when you observe what is there, that always leads to the profounder questions. And perhaps a better way of putting it, it always leads to the profounder conclusions. I see this world, and one of the things, we know this, we have some very sharp individuals here who are scientists, physicists. They understand these things better than I ever will. One of the things that we know is that matter isn't eternal. So the universe had a starting point. And so the question is, you go as far back as you want to go. The question is, where did it all come from? And the fact is, science can't answer that question. Because things don't just pop into existence. Science can't answer the question. Science can tell you this is a very complex world. Science can tell you things don't pop into existence. So by virtue of there being anything, including you and all of your complexity, the question ought to be asked, well, then where did I come from? How did that come about? These are the deeper questions. Another question, why is there uniformity to it all? Why is it uniform? Why is it that natural causes can be explained and there's consistency from one process to the next, and we can develop a theory and then we can put it to the test and then we can see, oh, that works. Why is there consistency to it? Another thing, I know that I'm here. Descartes said, I think, therefore I am. Why am I here? What's the deeper reason? What is my purpose? The things of the head, the things we perceive with the senses, they always lead to the profounder questions. They always lead to the deeper questions. This is the way that it works. So the nature things always point to the things of grace. In other words, again, physics should move us to metaphysics and then epistemology and then ethics and all of these things. This world that we live in is not just particulars. A human being is not just a collection of atoms. And we know this. We know this, don't we? We know this to our very core. We know that to be human means something higher. Every human from the beginning of time has separated human beings from animals. And it's not just the fact that we're conversational. It's the fact that we are moral, and there's so much more even to it than just that. We know that these things that we see are pointing to something higher. Let me give you a scripture that just, everything I've said to this point, this scripture says it in the simplest terms. This is from Romans chapter 1, verses 18 to 20. Paul there, speaking of the pagans, he says, the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. They suppress the truth. Well, Pilate said, "What is truth?" And he walked away, as though there was no answer to it, who by their unrighteousness suppressed the truth. And then he explains, he says, "For what can be known about God?" So when you see truth here, he's talking about what can be known about God. The things that can be known about God, and notice what he says. He says the things that can be known about God is plain to them. Because what? Because God has shown it to them. God has shown it to them. What do you mean by that? Well, notice how he immediately says, for his invisible attributes. Notice this. God showed it. God showed man something that man could then know to be true, such that it would be inexcusable to say that it wasn't true. God showed it. And then he says, and by the way, these are invisible things. So how do you show something that's invisible? Again, how does the lower story speak to the upper story? This is what Paul's talking about, because he says this. He's shown it to them for his invisible attributes, namely these things, his eternal power and his divine nature. And what did he say? He said they have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made. In other words, Paul is saying, if you look at all of this, God baked it into your humanity, he baked it into your intellect, he baked it into your soul to then let, A point to B. There's a conclusion here. I'm not going to be satisfied with the results of science. I'm not going to be satisfied with saying, I can tell you all about who I am. This is the nature of my organs. Here's how they evolved through time, which I don't believe in evolution in that sense. But this is, even if you could explain it in such a way, it's not going to answer the deeper questions that people have. Paul says this. Paul says the things of God can be known to them. In other words, the lower story has a stair set to the upper story. Okay? You picture that house. The things of nature, the lower, grace, the higher, they're not irreconcilable. You can draw a circle around them. They cohere. You can go back and forth between the two of them. Okay? So they are connected. Here's another verse that speaks to this very thing. The psalmist says, the heavens declare, the heavens, and by that he means the sky. And he says the sky, the physical sky that you can see, the visible sky, it's saying something. It's declaring. And what's it declaring? It is saying that God is glorious. That's what it's saying. You look around, it's not like, we don't live in a chaotic, ugly world. We live in a very consistent, beautiful world. The stars, you can track them. They always move in the same patterns, in the same order. And we can go out and we can do this. And what it's saying is, number one, that God is glorious. And there's another proclamation, and it is that this is the handiwork of God. In other words, God made it. When you look out and you see the magnitude of the universe, you can determine a couple of things. God is a God of glory and beauty, and therefore goodness. And God is a God who designed all of this. This is his handiwork. I can't even imagine something as big as that. Now, the Christian worldview is one of that kind of congruence and that kind of coherence. That's the Christian worldview, is being able to see physical phenomenon and recognize and know that's not where the answers stop. There's an even deeper explanation, and the higher things, the things of the soul, my longing for a God, my desire to be in fellowship with my Creator, my desire to love my neighbor, or at least to say that my neighbor should love me. A lot of people are not moral until they look at you and say, you ought to do this. Now, I won't personally do it, but you ought to do it. And what that speaks to is, there's a basic morality there. Even in the most immoral people, there's a basic morality there. In the most wicked of all people, they may not have any care in the world for you, but they will say, but you ought to do this for me. We see this all the time. We're seeing this today. So a Christian worldview is one where these things cohere. Lower story and upper story are in congruence. Now, This is critical. If you want to understand the time we live in today, this is really the foundation of understanding what in the world is happening today in the thinking and the religion and the ideas of men. What has happened today is that somebody has come along and the staircase from the lower story to the upper story has been barred and shut off with a 3-foot brick wall. And the floor between the lower story and the upper story was separated by 3 feet of concrete. And these two realms, the lower story and the upper story, are irreconcilable. You cannot get from one to the other by way of reason. You cannot get there rationally. Kierkegaard came along, and we're going to say more about him, and he said, if you want to get to the upper story, you have to take a blind leap. That is not the historic Christian understanding of things. But even prior to Kierkegaard, this is what happened. What is it that would bar the upper story from the lower story? So here's a way of just conceiving it. You're left with man. See, you and I and our minds and our biology and all of that, we're down here on the lower story. And you may have some romantic idea of religion and the heart and all of these kinds of things. You may have these ideas, but all that you are is physical substance. And you're down here on the lower story. There's no way to get to the upper story. Here's a question. What is it that bars these stories from one another? What is it that makes them irreconcilable? And here it is in a nutshell. It is the naturalistic presupposition. That's what it is. This is what has barred the lower story from the upper story. It's when man in his intellect presupposed the naturalistic paradigm, which is that the entirety of the world can be explained through natural processes in a closed system. And the second part of that is key. We recognize, we have physicists here, we have biologists here, and doctors. We know that there are natural processes, right? We recognize this. But the conception of man, and this happened a couple centuries ago, man decided that the world was rendered down totally to natural processes in a closed system. And that means there is no imposition from the outside world. There is no imposition from the divine. God is not reaching in and reordering things. If there's a God, which they're agnostic about that, then God put it to work, stepped away from it like a clock, and has done nothing with it ever since. Now just imagine what the conclusion would then be. Imagine where that leads. If it's true that the world is totally natural processes in a closed system, then there's never been a miracle, because that's something from outside the system working into nature. Jesus didn't walk on water, neither did Jesus raise from the grave. And perhaps the chief of all miracles, that God broke through nature and spoke to man miraculously through the prophets, coming into the natural mind of man to give him a better understanding of things. That also did not happen. So what does man then conclude? There's no outside force that's coming in. Upper story is disconnected from the lower story, so the only thing that a man has is himself as the integration point for all things. Man begins with himself and ends with himself. Humanism, as Schaeffer says, means that man is the measure of all things. And so you can imagine the scientific revolution, which was brought about initially by Christians, brought us to this very confident perspective of the world. John Locke and those of his sort said, we can now understand everything. We can know all of the answers. And so man very confidently set forward by his own devices to determine all meaning, to determine all morality, totally through rationalism. Because remember this, the story, you're not going to get any answers from God. That's severed, that's disconnected. We're assuming naturalism. So man is then going to go forward, and he's going to answer his questions all on his own. And he started off very confident about this. The scientific revolution brought about the period of modernism, modernity. And this is where you have guys like Immanuel Kant and John Locke and David Hume and Hegel. And these guys said, we can know all of the answers by ourselves. We can know it by our own thinking. We can know it by our own devices. We can answer these things through hyper-rationalism. But when they couldn't agree, so just imagine this, man of his own, the smartest of men. They said, we're going to find out all the answers. You had all of the experts coming out with a disparity of conclusions. Man is the way to know all the answers. And you look at the most educated of men, the one to whom we'd given the greatest amount of clout, and they could not agree. Imagine all of the experts in disparity. Kind of sounds like today. Imagine all of the people who claim that they know all of the things. Just imagine it even in the health paradigm. Somebody said margarine is better. Don't eat the butter that came from a cow. Right? And they said, I'm an expert. Listen to me. No, that doesn't make any sense. But again, this is what has happened. And when there was a disparity of voices within the period of philosophical modernity, do you know what it led to? Postmodernism. The presupposition was man can only know anything by his own devices. And so the men with the greatest mental faculty set out to find all of the answers. And none of them could agree. And so what did that lead to? A great skepticism. That's what postmodernity is. That's what postmodernism is. It's a skepticism about any kind of big answer or certainty about anything. Because look, we already went through this period where people said these are the answers, and they were all in conflict with one another. Look at this, because this is paralleled all throughout history, and it goes back to the very beginning. Now the whole earth had one language and the same words, and as people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there, and they said to one another, come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. Then they said, come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves. Let us be dispersed over the face of the whole earth. And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the children of man had built. And the Lord said, behold, they are one people, and they have all one language, and this is only the beginning of what they will do. And nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. These were the first humanists. Man being the measure of all things. We can do all things. We can find all the answers. We can build a tower to heaven. We will replace God. And so God said, come, let us go down there and confuse their language so that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord dispersed them from there over the face of all the earth, and they left off building the city. Therefore its name was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the people, and from there the Lord dispersed them over the face of all the earth. The point of this passage and what we're witnessing today is that when the deeper questions and when the higher order is left to the rationalism of man, apart from divine revelation, disconnected from the Creator, confusion is the only thing that can follow. We need answers that come from outside of ourselves. The modern self-movement says all of the answers are within you. Just follow your heart where it leads. There is only lostness in there. This is the problem of postmodern thinking. And I want to say this. You want to say, what's a Christian worldview all about? The Christian worldview totally rejects the idea that man is the measure of all things. We totally reject the idea that man has to come up with all of the answers through rationalism. God gave us brains that can make sense of things, and yet it will go beyond that. It must go to the higher place. We believe within the Christian worldview that God has spoken to us in a couple of ways. God has spoken to us through nature. This is why Paul says that the things of God are plain to those that observe them because God showed it to them. They're speaking of God. We believe that the stars declare the glory of God. God has spoken to us through nature, but God has also spoken to us through grace. And in particular, what I mean is God has given us His word. God has spoken through the prophets. There is a lineage of thousands of years of prophets and voice pieces from God who spoke to us in succession. in a coherent way, where there's a singular story from the beginning to the end, always pointing to Jesus Christ and God reconciling all things back to himself again. The Christian worldview believes that we need God. Now, I want to finish by giving you a brief case study of someone, again, who's inconsistent with this, and then a word from the Lord that I want to leave you with. There have been, when man determined that the naturalistic framework is the way to understand everything, when man determined that everything could be understood through natural processes in a closed system, man came out on the other end saying, well, then all of life is meaningless. Because our cosmology goes back to an impersonal accident. There was no intention, there was no purpose for it. And our teleology, which is where we're going, where does all of this end? Everybody's looking forward. It ends in nothing. The naturalist says, in fact, it ends in a big fiery blaze. One day all of this will just burn up, and that's all that there is. When man decided that, he very naturally assumed from that point that everything is chaos and we should just live like it. So there was a composer in the early 20th century named John Cage. And what John Cage decided to do, he believed that art should be reflective of reality, and I also think that it should be. The reason why postmodern art is often so ugly is because it's reflective of an ugly reality. Whereas the art of the Renaissance is not. It's beautiful because it's reflective of a worldview that knew there was such a thing as beauty. But John Cage, this composer, this is what he did. He said art should be reflective of reality. So what he did was he decided to make all of his music totally by chance. So rather than making something that was melodic and beautiful, he chose to make different notes that came about totally by chance. Flipping of a coin. He even had a mechanical conductor that he created that was not on a proper timing, and everything was chaos. If you listen to some of this, it's just complete, sheer chaos. This is what he believed that music should be, because he believed that reflected reality. But listen to this. In a 1912 edition of The New Yorker, John Cage was being interviewed. And in addition to his totally nonsense music, he had become an amateur, actually very skilled mycologist, someone that studies mushrooms, knows which ones you can eat, which ones you can't, what their purposes are for. And this is a quotation from the article in 1912. John Cage says, the article says, no matter how much mycology one knows, and Cage is now one of the best amateur mycologists in the country, with one of the most extensive private libraries ever compiled on the subject, there's always the possibility of a mistake in identification. You don't want to pick the wrong mushroom, okay? And so this is a quotation from John Cage. John Cage said, I became aware that if I approached mushrooms in the spirit of my chance operations, like what he'd done in music, he said, then I would die shortly. So I decided that I would not approach them in this way. Do you see this? Church, do you recognize the importance of what he just said? He says that it's total chance, total chaos, and yet he does not live like that where it matters. Why? Because there's such a thing as structure. This mushroom today, if it's the same mushroom tomorrow, it'll be good to eat tomorrow. This particular variety of mushroom you can never eat. It will always be poison for you. Why? Because it's not chaos. Because it's not chance. Because it's not disordered. In fact, I will say this. Explosions, which is the naturalistic presupposition, do not lead to order. Have you ever seen an explosion go off anywhere in the world and seen it construct anything? Have you ever watched an explosion anywhere construct anything useful or helpful? Never. It does not work that way. Explosions bring chaos. And we see a very ordered world, which means there was a very ordered mind behind it. So here's what I will say to you in closing. Jesus is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For by him all things were created, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things, notice this, all things were created through him and for him. There's your cosmology. What is all this about? Where did it come from? It came from Jesus some time ago. It came from Jesus. That's your cosmology in a Christian worldview. And Jesus is before all things, and in him all things hold together. There is your coherence. The head and the heart. The word that he uses here for holds together is the word cohere. In Greek, that's what the word means. The head and the heart of man can be joined together. The lower story and the upper story are connected. And so here's my word to you. Make Jesus the center of your world. Put him at the center of your home. Put him at the center of your mind. Think about him often. Have conversations with him in real life. Bring him into your home as a real part of the family, not a fanciful part of the family. He really is a part of the home. He's as real as anyone sitting at your dinner table. Jesus entered the world a couple of thousand years ago, and he literally walked on this earth in a body. He was a historical figure. Even the atheist will say this. Everyone agrees, even the atheist, that he was a good man. Muhammad says he was a great man, and you should listen to him. Well, okay, Muhammad, I will. I will go and I will listen to him. He says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. There are a plurality of witnesses that saw him on earth, and it changed everything about their world. There was a skeptic who, in his history of Charlemagne from Augustus to Charlemagne, he said, it must be said, this is W.E.H. Lecky, he said, it must be said that Jesus has done more to soften and regenerate the hearts of mankind than all of the disquisitions of philosophers and all of the exhortations of moralists. He didn't believe in Jesus, but he said, Jesus made the world a better place. He was a real man. He really walked here. He was really crucified under the hand of Pontius Pilate. And there are a plurality of witnesses that gave their lives for him. They said, I saw him risen, and I will die for him, just as he died for me. We serve a risen Savior, and he is the center of our world. And if you'll do that, if you'll bring him into your world, he will change everything about your life and bring you into a state of peace. If you have any need at all, you can let it be known while we stand and while we sing.